Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cinematic Schematic, the official podcast of the Cinematropolis.com, your home to thoughtful conversations on film. Today, we'll be back with our fourth entry in our 3 films that got you through the 2020 pandemic interview series. For those of you just tuning in this series, I am speaking with a wide variety of friends, colleagues, and professionals working in the film industry, largely in my backyard of Oklahoma. I'll be talking with each guest about how the pandemic has impacted their line of work before talking about the 3 films that helped them get through it all. Today, I'll be joined by film studies educator, film critic, and Ward 2 City Council person in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, James Cooper. I'll be talking with James about the importance of film and media literacy in today's culture and how the pandemic impacted how he taught his classes and interacted with his students before getting into the 3 films that got him through the 2020 pandemic. Now, before we really jump into the meat and potatoes of today's conversation, I just wanted to quickly note, if you enjoyed today's interview, please consider leaving us a rating, review, and follow or subscribe on your preferred podcast app. It really is the most impactful way that you can support the show at this time. Or if you're really engaged with this idea, the 3 films that got you through the 2020 pandemic, another way that you can participate in this special series is by emailing your 3 films to our email address, thecinemetropolis@gmail.com, or by sharing your picks by following us on Twitter @thecinemetrop or on Facebook at facebook.com/thecinemetropolis. Please send us your picks for a chance to have them heard later in the series. Now, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about today's very special guest, James Cooper. I connected with James several years ago now through our time working concurrently as film critics here in Oklahoma. He really has done it all. His work detailing film, Oklahoma culture, federal hate crimes legislation, and Oklahoma City's LGBTQ+ community has appeared in a wide variety of publications, including the Oklahoma Gazette, the Huffington Posts, and Non-Doc. And he even wrote a very thoughtful piece for us here at the Cinematropolis back in June 2018 called The Coming of Age Through Queer Cinema. And I'll have that linked in today's show notes. Outside of his work as a writer, James is also an educator. He formerly served in Oklahoma City Public Schools, specifically as an avid middle school college preparation teacher. And again, he is a published writer who lives in Oklahoma City's historic Paseo neighborhood. Currently, he works as an adjunct English professor at the University of Central Oklahoma and as an adjunct film studies and philosophy professor at Oklahoma City University, where he serves on OCU's Arts and Sciences Advisory Board. And of course, I think it's very important to note that in April 2019, James took the oath of office to begin his first term on the Oklahoma City Council as the representative for Ward 2. As city council person, he also serves as a trustee on the Central Oklahoma Transportation and Parking Authority Board of Trustees. Needless to say, James is not only one of the smartest and most active people I've ever had the pleasure of knowing, but he's also easily one of the most empathetic. And I think this is a side of him you're really going to hear come out throughout our conversation today. Oh, and by the way, did I mention he's also very passionate about horror films? Most notably, he loves to go to bat for Scream 2, which you'll hear about today. Another thing I want to note about James is that when talking to him, I've really learned that he's not just giving you his quick opinion. He's telling his story through well-read references to everything from Richard Linklater's Waking Life to essays like The Myth of Total Cinema. He's not just providing a quick take. He's not just rapid fire throwing his opinion out there, but rather he is taking you on a journey to ensure that his perspective is clear, honest, and grounded so that you can really understand the full picture of what his point of view is. We're going to jump into the conversation here in a moment, but I do want to note that we recorded this in mid-January, which was before his spring semester had started and also before Inauguration Day had occurred. So there's a couple of references that allude more towards that January time period. So how exactly did the pandemic change the way James thought about education and the value of media literacy? Well, stay tuned for one moment to hear what James has to say. All right, everybody. I'm so excited to be back with another very special guest as part of our 3 films that got you through the 2020 pandemic series. I'm very happy to be joined by a friend and a film critic, a film studies educator, and also the Ward 2 City Council person here in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And I should probably mention also my city council person, James Cooper. James, welcome to the Cinematic Schematic.
Hi, thanks for having me, Caleb.
Last year was kind of wild, right? But we did make it through 2020. All things considered, how are you doing today?
Since we're playing the film game, I'm doing all right. Thanks for asking. You know, we survived 2020, but it kind of feels a little bit, and I say this as a horror fan, but it kind of feels a little bit like Laurie Strode surviving, Halloween, and then Halloween 2 picking right up the same night. And it's like, gotcha, we're not done.
That's right. The next round of horror could potentially ensue. Yes. Okay, so James, I think we are going to get to those 3 films here in a little bit. But first, I really just want to talk a little about, your profession and how the events of last year impacted what you do. So, of course, as I mentioned there, you're an educator. You teach in the subjects of English, film, and philosophy. Before we get into the full picture, I just want people to know exactly where you're coming from. Why do you think the literacy of film and pop culture continues to be so important, especially as we're coming out of a pandemic?
Most important is media literacy right now. There was a PBS documentary you might have seen came out last year called The United States of Conspiracy. Did you see that?
I did see that.
Frontline, always doing just incredible investigative journalism. And, I finished that documentary just so worried about our city, state, and country. I think media literacy is at the root of so much of what ails us. If you went to a K through 12 school and you had a film studies or media studies class, you're in the minority, like the smallest of minorities. Most of us don't learn film history, television history, radio history. And that's really important. The 2016 election was also another moment that stood out to me because seeing the Russian interference in that election in terms of creating memes and GIFs and that disinformation campaign they unleashed, it didn't surprise me as a film studies scholar because, and you know very well, who was at the forefront 100 years ago, doing experiments on what editing was, like in its infancy, how to take one image, put it up against the next, and then in that third image generate meaning for the person viewing it. Well, that was the Soviets, and so that was not a huge step for me come 2016 to go, oh yeah, of course the Soviets are doing this. In the same, you could also note how in the 40s, our country created propaganda films to get people to fight in World War II. Now, again, defeating fascists, very important goal. At the same time, we also have to acknowledge the role Hollywood and filmmaking played in encouraging folk to join the war effort. Or you look in Germany on a 180 spin, right, during that same period of time, watching Hitler and his folk take over the existing German film industry and its directors through fear and intimidation to make movies denigrating Jewish folk, queer folk, people of color, and rallying around that sort of nationalism and eventually, fascism. And so, yeah, I think film plays and media studies just plays a critical role to understanding how media mediates reality for us. None of us have met Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, but we think we know them because we've seen them. And I think it's critical for us to start doing a better job of educating people what film has been from 1895 to present, how individuals and governments can manipulate images to move us in whatever direction that they want. And so just really teaching kids, and especially as we move into adulthood, how to put on our critical thinking caps when we are consuming any image. And, that's going to be a major issue going forward, because here's the other thing, the devil, as they like to say, the devil knows the Bible too. And so it's really easy for someone to go on YouTube these days and hear a version of what I just said, like, don't trust any of these images, right? but not really giving that fuller context of what's going on there. So I think we've made a nation of conspiracy theorists, and we're going to have to undo that. And so media literacy plays a role in that.
Right. It seems. It also seems like the tools have never been like more accessible. And just thinking about like how many deep fakes have sort of like kind of come to the surface in the last couple of years. And I mean, even down to seeing like Jordan Peele doing his, just to prove a point, showing people his Barack Obama deep fake and like saying, hey, this tech's out here. I think that's really important. Just with the amount of misinformation or half truths that get kind of spun out from any website or it could be film or television show even. Let's talk a little bit about your day-to-day as an educator and exactly what that looked like pre-pandemic. So what did the job and the process of planning classes and film studies curriculum look like?
So from August of 2015 through August of 2019, I was teaching as a college preparation teacher on the south side of our city in our public school systems at Jefferson Middle School. Previously, I was teaching as an adjunct in film studies and English, and we were having such a teacher crisis, you recall, in Oklahoma, that they moved toward an emergency certification process. And so I went ahead and signed up for that. And toward the end, as I was running for office and I realized I was going to have to give up my teaching job in the K through 12 system, I started slowly making my way back into adjuncting again and teaching film studies at Oklahoma City University. And that's what I'm doing now is, philosophy and film studies and English, also at UCO, University of Central Oklahoma in Edmond. And the planning, what it looks like, well, it'll be a bit different today, but what it's always been is, at the start of a semester, I would create a syllabus that, that I thought would engage people from the beginning. I got that from an undergrad professor of mine in film studies at OU, who in her intro class, she would begin not with an art film or something from, that Soviet era we talked about in the teens and 20s, but with Die Hard. She was like, let's start with something they know and then use that as the entry into the bigger story, as it were. And so that's always been the start of the semester for me, is like, what is it? The Dark Knight Rises, or Who Framed Roger Rabbit, just something to get the conversation going. So creating that syllabus and then trying to align specific films that, help the students understand, whatever that week's focus is, whether it's genre, editing, cinematography, mise en scene, whatever it is, trying to find the right film to pair with the right scholarship. That's tough, and that shifts from semester to semester. And then the day to day, as when I was doing film studies, it was very much teach probably 2 days a week. And then there would be a screening, usually like outside of class, that we would do on campus in a screening room. And usually, let's just say it was Monday was class where we're introducing these concepts in the readings. Tuesday might be the screening for the film. So now they're seeing an example of those concepts. And then that Wednesday in class would be the, exploration of those concepts through what they just saw, and kind of being able to pull that film up on screen and do a closer reading, a closer textual reading to find examples of that concept and kind of let the students tease all that out. And that just would happen week by week. So that requires in-person classes, in-person screenings, in-person class. So that's the typical kind of layout of a film studies class. And that's what it was for me as an undergrad as well, and in grad school.
Well, I mean, so of course the face-to-face time, both in the classroom and in those sort of extracurricular screenings, pretty important. How did the shutting down of schools really impact your work as an educator?
So, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying about the country not really prioritizing media studies for folk. When I won office in February of 19, took office in April of 19, again, there were current city charter ordinances that prevented a K through 12 teacher from serving on council and serving in the K through 12 classroom. And I knew that. I knew that going into that election, but I thought so important it was to run at that particular time to try and get youth centers and further investments in public transit and bike and walkability infrastructure. I thought those things were so critical. And normally when you run for office, right, you can make promises, but you're really beholden to that budget, that annual budget. But when I say in this particular time, as you know, we have that 1 penny cent sales tax known as MAPS here in Oklahoma City. And that's not common. That, the first one was back in 93, then again, the late 90s, another one in 2009. So 2019, when I won, I knew that was coming. And it was like, I'm going to run. I'm going to go ask people what their concerns are for their neighborhood, hopes for our city. And we're going to fight like the Dickens to get that into MAPS 4. And we did. And if I accomplished nothing else, it just setting that in motion was just a wonderful moment. So I knew I had to quit K through 12. I knew it was worth losing my K through 12 job to go fight for those things. What I didn't see coming was the voters finding out about that at the end and being like, oh, we don't like that at all. And they have, as you remember, that special election to change that charter ordinance. But by that time I had already said, I'd made plans to go teach at OCU and UCO, as I had done prior to teaching at the middle school level. And enrollment was already at a place at OCU where I taught film previously. We didn't have enough enrollment numbers to make it where adjuncts could teach those classes. We really needed to make sure that our full-time professors had the workload that they needed to be able to, feed their families, feed themselves. So that was already a bit of a peril there for film studies. And it didn't really matter how successful my classes had been, whether it was teaching a television studies class or a children's cinema class, and the students just really giving me phenomenal feedback. The numbers weren't there. And then COVID hit, and it just made it all the more difficult to, imagine going to high school seniors who this time last year, around this time last year would have been learning there's a pandemic. It's highly contagious based on, droplets through one's mouth and through one's nose. And we want you to sit in a room together. That's a hard sell. Especially with the rising cost of college tuitions all across this country. How do you make that sell? And moreover, how do you make that sell to a student when so much, as the college experience is about the college experience? Like, it's about the dorms. It's about, being in those screening rooms, for instance, as film studies students, being able to watch on a giant movie theater size screen a film the way that director and that crew intended for us to view it. So those are really difficult sells to say to kids like, hey, come on to campus. And no matter how safe we make it, like that's a tough sell. And so our enrollment numbers went down at OCU. Our enrollment numbers went down at UCO. I use a lot of film, and we can talk about this later, but I use a lot of film and television in my philosophy classes I teach at OCU. And I usually teach 2 a semester, an arts and human values class. But where normally I would teach 2, and I did in the fall, this spring, our enrollment campus-wide, no longer just talking about film studies anymore, we're talking about campus-wide, our enrollment numbers were down just enough where I'll only be teaching the 1 class. Super thankful for that. And then at UCO, my 2 English classes, there are going to be some adjuncts who were going to teach 2 or 3, now all of a sudden finding themselves that they're not. So it's really, the pandemic has shifted the way we think about delivering higher education, and it's made the world a bit more unstable for us adjunct professors.
Yeah. Well, and I just think too, I mean, going back to that, what you mentioned about the college experience, I know so much of what made that experience unique wasn't the screenings were a big part of it, but also those conversations you'd have both formally right after the film with your professors present, but also like when you're walking back to your dorm room or with your roommate or some of your classmates, like at 2 a.m. in like a cafe or something like that, like those conversations is really a big part of the experience. It's I imagine it's quite hard to replicate or even foster as a professor, just because like the thing about Zoom calls is like there's not really a lot of water cooler talk or casual conversations. It's all everyone has to be very intentional about when and where they're having calls, and there's always a purpose behind it versus the more kind of casual um, conversations that people are having. I mean, is that something that you personally are really missing?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, hearing you describe your experiences, I've experienced it now on both ends as both a undergrad and grad student in film and screen studies, and now as a adjunct professor in that field. Like there would be moments where I'd be as an instructor after classes, after screenings, and those there's always a handful, right, of those students who are like kind of gravitate over and they're like, "Hey, let's talk about that Blue Velvet we just watched," and it's and not just talking about what we just watched, but like it starts going through the Rolodex of what they've already seen in their head. So they're like, well, that reminded me of this, and have you seen it? And there's, it's that cross cultural, exchange that's happening where people are making recommendations to me as their instructor. I'm going, oh yeah, well, if you like that, then you'll also, and so yeah, it's really about building in that way a community and learning more from each other.
To shift gears just a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about your specific experience as a film goer or you're a member of the Oklahoma Film Critics Circle. How did like the closing of movie theaters impact how you watched movies, if at all?
As you mentioned earlier, I serve on our Oklahoma Film Critics Circle. I was a film critic from 03 through 09 for an LGBTQ newsletter here at the time. And when it ceased publication in 09, I kind of kept my own blog, and a lot of people followed me onto that. But then come 2012, 13, I was like, I have a writing project I want to take on that was much bigger than a film review. And I just, my brain will not let me write multiple things at once. And so I started a creative writing MFA in 13 at OCU while I was teaching there, and just shifted my focus to that. And I would still do an annual top 10 list at the end as a freelancer. It was so much fun. And in fact, just sorry, I almost forgot. A couple years ago when My Friend Dahmer came out, you remember that movie?
Oh, yeah, yes.
I had so much fun with that film. And I put it on my top 10 list that year, doing freelance for NonDoc, a local publication, as you know. And I mentioned how strong the lead performance was, and cited that actor. Next thing I know, Twitter, he had gotten a hold of it and shared a link to that NonDoc story.
Very nice.
And yeah, it was so cool. My middle school students, as I mentioned, I was teaching middle school for a few years there. They were like, "Wait, you don't know who that is, Mr. Cooper?" And I was like, "No, I don't." And they're like, and they gave me an education on Disney. And they're like, he's playing a serial killer. I was like, mm-hmm. And so, but anyway, yeah. So I've kind of taken that break, but usually it would be, I go to a movie. I love Tinseltown during the day. Those are some cheap tickets for a great experience. I love going to Tower Theater, the independent theater here near my neighborhood, Rodeo Cinema. And that's just not what happened last year. Almost for all of the tragedies, and there's so many, as a film person, it just was so painful to not be able to go to a movie theater. I have such spiritual experiences when I am watching a movie. And in that way, a theater is almost like church. And for that to just be removed, is just horrible. And if anyone's like, what is he talking about, church? Go watch Waking Life the Linklater film, and there's like that whole scene, remember, where they talk about that kind of holy experience that happens when one is watching a film, the potential for it, at least. If one is like turning off their phone and turning off their mind from other things and just going, I am in this film. This is a work of art. Let's have this Greek catharsis. So it was hurtful for that last year. So starting March 15th, I just started keeping a list of everything that I was watching at home. And that's how I watched everything. I don't have cable. I got rid of that years ago, but I do have my Roku player and I have a few apps like Amazon, Netflix, Canopy, and the Criterion Channel. Excuse me. And so I would just start watching things. I would watch things from my own private collection. I have around 300 or so movies that I've collected since 1999 when DVDs first came out. And I have them, they're like on cube shelves, and they're alphabetical because I'm that guy. And I went cube by cube and would pick a film each morning when I would wake up. First thing in the morning was either I would wake up, I'd make coffee, and I'd go find a film and just in alphabetical order. I pulled off the shelf and I would just watch. And it was a way to start my day before I did any work for school, any work for council, self-care, I think they call it. And it was such an enriching experience because it reawakened me to my love for film. So much of my world has been so focused on city council in the last couple of years, running for office and then serving. So this really brought me back in a way that I'll never forget. And then by the end of the year, very similar to you, and I'm kind of curious from your own experience, by the end of the year, all those screeners from the movie studio started arriving, whether they were virtual links or DVDs. And so once school was done at the end of November, beginning of December, my days were just like, I turned off social media. I literally would just watch 2, 3, sometimes 4 movies a day.
Yeah. Well, I really like how you're describing it as a very sort of spiritual fulfillment. And I know, I think you and I share that in common and a couple of other friends where, I think I'd asked someone, LaRon Chapman, who's co-hosted many of these podcasts with me. And I texted him, gosh, I want to say I hadn't talked to him in a couple months because pandemic, it was like in May. I think I'm going to text him and said, hey, how's everything going? Just checking up. And he was like, it's like I can't breathe. I can't go to the movies, because it really is. I know for me, I fell off movie watching for a while, a lot of television shows, which is kind of strange. But it's one of those things where I didn't realize how much having a movie every week in the theater, 2 or 3 movies a week, because I go to the theater 2 or 3 times a week every week, but how much it helped me keep up with all the new releases. And the other thing is when I'm there, you kind of describe it as a spiritual, like almost like temple like experience. I'm never distracted when I go see something in a theater. Like I don't worry about my phone. I can just zone in. But when I'm at home on my couch, it's way easier for me to, or even like either, oh, this chore needs to be in. Oh, what's so-and-so saying on Twitter or something. So I applaud you for being able to shut off social media in your own home. I'm working on it, but as it will.
I appreciate the kind words, but we're in that struggle together. I disappeared off social media a week or 2 before Christmas, snuck back on the day before the attack on our Capitol, just to wish my friend a happy birthday, and then got right back off. And then that Wednesday, I was like, oh, I think I need to be on social media today, as I was watching live what was happening.
Yep.
And no, I'm really going to be pulling back from that and just social media and just kind of probably only being on there, once or twice a week, just for my own mental health. I think I don't think it's a healthy place for us if we don't moderate our interactions with it. And you nailed it, like being at home. And at first I was just beating myself up so much because I'd be watching a movie and I'd grab my phone.
Yep.
And that, you're right. When you go to a theater, you don't do that. That's not what I do. But here I was, I'd be watching something. I'm just like, ooh, The Guardian or New York Times or whatever, or NPR. And and finally at the end of the years, I started reading other critics' top 10 lists. I saw some of them address it, and it made me feel so much better. So like, how could we not look at our phones when, you know, the real world is on fire, literally on fire. Our West Coast was on fire, a plague that the likes of which we have not seen in 100 years is killing, I think it's almost 400,000 Americans. And that is not showing a sign of letting up. Think about it. We could have 500,000 dead Americans in the next couple months. And that is, so it was an interesting thing where film, you kind of had to ask yourself, like, what's the point? Like, why am I watching this? Like, what is the, when all of these very real, the historic reckoning with the legal legacy of racism and white supremacy, you see those protests taking place, 93 to 94% of them we know, peacefully, by the way. When you see those sorts of protests, you can't help but ask yourself, like, what should I be putting my attention on, watching this or, watching Annie Hall, which, by the way, wouldn't be my choice, but you get what I'm saying. So,
yeah. And I mean, just to echo the sentiment, I think that's sort of the challenge. And I think it seems like most people I know who are really inundated in the film culture and film watching kind of went through a similar journey at various points in the year where you feel bad for trying to escape, but then you feel nice because you're able to unplug, but then you're also simultaneously distracted sometimes. So it's like an escape, but it's like at times was an escape with sort of like that lingering feeling of there's a lot of craziness going on. I'm trying to figure out how to avoid it. But I also think, to your point, we did see a lot of great films come out this year. I know we're going to talk about that in a moment, but whether it was a comedy like Palm Springs that was quite enjoyable or the Small Axe series, there's a lot of powerful films that still were able to come out and I think address some of the things that you were talking about there a moment in a meaningful way. Now, I guess taking it a little bit back to the film education perspective, what exactly did you do to pivot and adjust to the circumstances to ensure that your students received as little disruption as possible?
2 English composition classes at UCO, 2 arts and human values classes at OCU. And I'll give you the kind of last 2 semesters in this one. So when the pandemic hit, keeping in mind the what do you call it? The shelter in place moment, the moment where the Utah Jazz player tested positive, that March 15th moment, that was right before our spring break. And we shifted everything online. Everything shifted online. I learned what Zoom was. I had no idea. Microsoft Teams didn't know. And coincidentally, I had decided the fall before, I created a class where for the first part of the class, we would watch a PBS documentary on the Italian Renaissance and the Medici family and compare that to a book written by New York Times writer, his best-selling book, Boomtown, on OKC history. And we would compare the 2 Renaissance stories, which at first students like, what? And I was like, trust me. And it was so revealing for both Renaissance stories. The second half of the class, in fall of 19, after I won, was looking at media violence. It's something I've always researched. That's really what my focus has been as a film studies person. But then UCO approached me at the end of that semester and said, hey, we have this program here where we're really trying to help create a support system, foster a support system for our African-American male students especially. And so they're trying to get them enrolled in kind of as groups in certain classes, Comp 1, 2, whatever. And they asked me if I'd be interested. And I was like, well, I'd be interested, but I'd want to shift the curriculum, I think, a little bit to meet that. And they were like, go for it. And what that evolved into was still doing Boomtown with the Italian Renaissance. But then for the second half of the semester, a 6-part, hour-long episode each documentary from PBS on African-American history. And what I did was I paired that. I said, episode by episode, we'll do a film featuring Black characters. Not necessarily a film directed by someone Black, but just the representation. And there would be, I was like, I will give you all a very basic prompt, compare someone or something from this episode to someone or something in this film. So like an example would be, they were going to watch and did watch Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And then which they loved. And they would compare that to the second episode of that documentary, where it's from 1800 to 1861 or something like that. The Age of Slavery, I think it's called. Well, there's not an obvious comparison there. Those students found it one by one by one. They were like, okay, Miles Morales reminds us of former Congressman Robert Smalls when he commandeered this ship from the South to make his way to freedom in the North. And I'm just sitting back because I didn't know what they were going to say and do. And they just, oh my gosh, took it in and everywhere. But that part of the course, the many rivers and the black films, that did not start until that Shelter in Place started. So I had this whole plan where I was going to have the movies on reserve for them in the library so they could watch them on their own or whatever. Couldn't do that now. So since it all shifted online, I went online and put those prompts in a discussion thread week by week. And then, they just responded in the thread. So that was that. In this fall, because I was spring semester during all of the pandemic. In the fall, OCU returned to in-person. UCO is a hybrid of some students were taking it in person where the camera was coming into the class for the extended classroom kids. So there was the extended classroom being online. So there was this camera for them to be able to see what was going on. And then there was the in-class students. And I kept that same syllabus because I was having so much fun with it, and the students were too. And so now what it is, or what it was in the fall, was, I said, hey, the Medici documentary and the Black History documentary, those are on Amazon. There's a 6-month free trial. Go do that. So that's how they were able to watch it. And then I only chose films that were on Netflix or Amazon so that students could take advantage of that trial. And that worked. This semester, I'm even more excited because what I'm doing, same sort of syllabus setup, 2 Renaissance stories, the Black history for the second half, but this time they're going to do HBO's Watchmen.
Wow.
It's the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I thought, it's not a film class. Neither of these are. That's why we're reading an entire book, Boomtown. We're watching these 2 PBS documentaries, exploring the relationship between art and place. That's kind of the theme for these classes. And it just clicks, like everyone's watching television. So let's talk about television. And so I'm buying DVDs of Watchmen to put on reserve in their library so you can get it from the circulation desk for free, go into one of the private rooms, watch it by themselves. Or if a student wants to, they can do that free HBO trial for a month and watch it that way, because those episodes I compacted into about a month. And then instead of asking them to do Amazon and all that, I found there's this Metropolitan Library System site called Hoopla. Did you know about this?
I have never heard of Hoopla. Tell me more.
You can go on there and you'll find that Renaissance documentary. You'll find Many Rivers to Cross. You'll find a lot of documentaries. You'll also find another film that I used to start off this particular semester for the last 3 semesters, Night of the Living Dead. They have a lot of movies on there. And so I'm really excited about that because all the student has to have is a library card, and they can stream those documentaries right from their phone or their laptop. They can stream Night of the Living Dead. And then all I, from there have to ask them to do is like, hey, I'm going to put Watchmen on reserve for you. Watch it in the library that way, or you can, do this free HBO trial. So it's really changed how I would normally I'd put these movies on reserve for the English students and the philosophy students, just put it on reserve at the circulation desk. They'd go grab it, watch it at home, watch it in the library. But the very delivery of it all has changed. But I'm actually excited this semester to be able to explore that, because I think the only films we're watching are Django and three: Django, Night of the Living Dead, and you'll get a kick. Evil Dead 2 has nothing to do with any of these themes, but I needed an essay assignment early in the semester where I could have them kind of explore genre tropes, giving them scholarship about those tropes, the occult film in this instance, and then being able to demonstrate that they can do textual analysis, rhetorical analysis using peer-reviewed scholarship, right? And so I was like, what do I pair this occult essay with? And I kept looking on Netflix and Amazon, and finally I saw Evil Dead 2 was there. I was like, well, that's horror and funny, so that'll be fun. Anyway, so it's been all over the place. So I'm excited to talk to them about how they watch things, kind of the way you're asking me.
And to clarify, when you said Django, just for listeners, that is Django Unchained or the original?
No, the Unchained. We watched it last semester. That and Into the Spider-Verse were the students' just clear favorites. Everything else they liked, they loved those two. And we paired Django with a documentary episode where it was, I want to say it was definitely during Jim Crow, so it wasn't during slavery, but it was like, I want to say from like 1897 to 1940s. And you wouldn't think the comparison, like, well, but this is a movie about slavery, so what are we talking about? But those students just ran with it. They're like, well, this makes sense because Django's this, freed slave, and yet the structures of the society tell him he's not, and it dictates where he can and cannot go. And they're like, that's Jim Crow. And it's like, ooh. And by the way, that's those students. They figure, all I do as their instructor is just say, you figure out where the comparison is here. And it was fun.
And this is probably a separate podcast, but I really appreciate the choice of Watchmen. Of course, blew up last year and a half since it aired. I don't know, is that one obviously being so integral to Oklahoma's history? And as far as I can tell, the first time the Tulsa Race Massacre has been portrayed on the screen. Do you anticipate this being one that you'll go back to again in the future?
I do. I think what forced my hand to change this semester was that I had, much to my surprise, I had several English Comp 1 students at UCO sign up for Comp 2. Well, I had just planned to keep doing the same syllabus and strengthening it, each semester. But then it clicked like, oh no, like I can't just give them the same thing. And I was like, well, what if I gave them for the first half something that was the same, but instead, for Comp 2, since it's more about research, not just asking them to make those comparisons, but saying, who's the source that stood out to you in this episode? Like, who's talking at you? What are their credentials at the bottom? Why are we listening to them? And having them cite that person as they're then also citing their comparison. So it's like, so you made this comparison, who helped you think through that? And just really getting them thinking about sourcing information and the credibility of the importance of credibility and peer-reviewed sources. So we did not do that in Comp 1. And that's going to force the Comp 2 students, like they can't fake it. Like they can't be like, oh, I already watched it, so I know. It's like, no, you did it, not like this. And then with the Many Rivers to Cross documentary in Watchmen, I'm going to do the same thing. It's like, no, you don't. It's not that you watched it once and you're done. Now go back and you tell me not just who your comparison is or what it was, but who's the scholar? Like, who's the scholar here? So it's a way to really force them to understand what close readings are and slowing down the research process. And then ultimately, I didn't, because they were these new students, I was like, well, I don't want to give them the same films. That doesn't quite work. And then I just started realizing the anniversary of the Race Massacre was here. They're already reading Boomtown about Oklahoma City's history. The Many Rivers to Cross documentary talks about the Race Massacre. So it just kind of felt like the transition was just there for us. And And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a way for the comp students who were with me last semester to really see their research skills and critical thinking skills go that much deeper. It'll be fun also to explore their writing more deeply too. And then the OCU students who are seeing it for the first time, I think what will end up happening is, and I'll just be curious for your thoughts, but I think that in the fall, it'll probably be the syllabus that I did in the fall with the films. And then in the spring, it'll be the Watchmen. And so that way it'll be,
Well, it provides opportunities to look at television versus film as well, and other like because I mean, especially with the way things have been moving this year, it seems like television's only going to continue to grow in popularity,
especially with those streaming services now, right? Moving into production, right? They're no longer just the exhibition, but they're playing that production role too, and so. Yeah, I think Netflix and Amazon and Hulu are we as film folk are going to have to really rethink how we talk about and teach our field.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the two examples that come to mind just when I think about how sort of that field is changing is, I mean, I mentioned the Small Axe series from Steve McQueen earlier. There was actually some debate in the Oklahoma Film Critics Circle about whether or not those were films or not. They aired on television or aired as a series on Amazon. I think it aired on BBC over in the UK. And there was a whole rationale that Steve McQueen wanted people who wouldn't actually make it out to movie theaters. There was a lot of conversation, I mean, both in the Film Critics Circle, but also just online about, hey, do these qualify as films? But outside of the fact, the way that they were sort of released, they really do look and sound and are produced like 5 individual films. So it's interesting. And then I also think about another really popular sort of mini series that came out this year on Netflix was Queen's Gambit. It's a one-off. It very well could have been a movie. They just stretched it out over several different episodes because they thought that would, be the best fit for the story. So I don't know. It's an interesting time for media.
Yeah, I'm excited. I finished the OCU syllabus yesterday. After we finish this interview, I'll create the UCO one, and theirs is going to be a little bit different because they're, the OCU students, they're just in terms of writing something. I mentioned Evil Dead earlier. I don't think I'm going to have them write that essay. That's just going to be more to kind of explore the genre of the occult, see how it transitions from '68 with Night of the Living Dead to, the '80s. So, and they're going to do a research paper, and they'll know very early in the semester, I want a proposal on what movie or TV show or book or album or video game you want to research to explore the relationship between art and place. Like, how did place shape that text you're reading or you're watching or you're listening to? And so they'll just have that one assignment in addition to those weekly responses, right? But UCO is different because it's a research class, so they're going to have to write they're going to have to demonstrate they understand rhetorical analysis at the beginning with that Evil Dead essay. You're probably familiar with film scholar Carol Clover and Men, Women, and Chainsaws. That's the essay that they're reading is the opening up one. Everyone always talks about Her Body Himself because that's where she comes up with the final girl theory, and I love that essay and I think it's great. But I think we need to also talk about the occult genre one where she's talking about all these supernatural films and the role of gender there, because that subgenre has been the most profitable one in the last 20 years in America, The Conjuring, whatever.
Right.
So I love exploring that with them. So they'll write that essay, and then they'll also, similar to OCU students, write me a proposal for what they want to research, give me some annotations, and then write an essay in their way. But they're also, when they watch Watchmen, they're going to read from a book. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Make Room for Television.
Ooh, title's familiar. I have not read it myself, though.
It's worth your time. One of my professors in grad school, not my creative writing MFA, but the work I did before in English and screen studies, she was a television scholar, which until I got to grad school, I did not know that was a thing. But one of her professors wrote that book. And it's kind of seen as a seminal text for us in media studies. And so I'm excited to read that because it's like the early history. And when I say early history, I mean like the early middle class that happens after the Civil War, the shape of the home, and then eventually where the television fits in terms of furniture, and those conversations about it as furniture, and those conversations about the negativity it could be bringing into the home in terms of influencing family in not good ways. So I'm excited to read that history with the students, and then just kind of hearing them, what their responses are to it and how they think that that's changed in the present day. What's similar, what's different. So I'm very excited to hear their responses this semester.
Yeah, man, I'm going to check that book out. Again, just kind of thinking about this whole conversation about how the media of television and film and that line is becoming a little blurrier. I think some really interesting and important context and history to have when thinking about how it, how these things are changing today. Let's actually shift gears a little bit. We've already talked quite a bit about year 2021, but on the whole, does it seem like it's shaping up about the same, looking up a little bit, or maybe just entirely different than what you did last year?
I'm very hopeful about the ramping up of vaccine production, not just vaccine production, but the supplies associated with the administering of the vaccine. So I've talked to her every Friday. I'm on a Zoom call with OKC County Health officials and Metro elected officials, learning updates about the pandemic and now the vaccine. And, I asked them a few weeks ago, I was like, I'm to understand there's a supply chain problem here. Are we affected by it? What's going on? So we need gloves, syringes, like those sorts of things to be able to administer the vaccine. And then more doses of the vaccine themselves. So I'm really hopeful that the new administration uses the Defense Production Act, similar to the way that FDR did during World War II, to ramp up production of those supplies and of the vaccine, so that we can administer so much more. I'll give you an example. OKC County Health, I asked them yesterday, how many doses are you all requesting versus how many we receive? 25,000 a week we've asked for, just our county, 25,000. 6,900 we received.
Oh, a lot of work to be done there. Yikes.
Yeah. So when we look at why folk are signing up for appointments who are 65 plus, because we're in that phase where they should be receiving it, and we wonder, why aren't there enough appointments? It's because there's not enough supply. And we are in historic unprecedented times, which call for historic unprecedented measures. And looking back to the way we ramped up the production, only the Defense Production Act would allow us to utilize industry to focus its just everything on this sort of production. And so I'm hopeful we'll do that, so that we can actually meet President-elect Biden's goal of 100 million people vaccinated in I think his first 100 days or something like that. But to be honest, I just think that it's going to take through summer before we get to people outside of that K through 12, 65 plus, people with comorbidities. I still think we have a ways to go. And then, oh my gosh, our essential workers are people working at grocery stores and fast food. It's just horrible. And so my hope is that by fall, we're in a better place. And I hope that's where we are, because I think our enrollment numbers depend on that at the higher education level. I think our K through 12 students really deserve further investments for their safety, returning to school in the fall. And I know the new the incoming administration has made those proposals too. So I'm hopeful that, Congress approves that $1.9 trillion proposal, and we get people vaccinated. We continue to mask. We continue the physical distancing, and that by August we're at a place where we see an end to the pandemic. My thought is August at the earliest, and probably Thanksgiving is the more realistic timeline. And if that hasn't happened, then something's gone very wrong along the way. And so I really, when I ran, I said I'd be transparent with everybody. So that's just me being transparent with everybody. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful we're in a movie theater again.
Yes, most definitely. And James, it's one thing I really appreciate about you is your transparency and your honesty in these scenarios. So I appreciate that you are sharing that with our listeners today. And also, fingers crossed, there's a new Matrix movie coming out this year, hopefully. And I think that one's not due out until like November, December. So hopefully we'll be able to go see that one on the big screen.
I don't know what's going to be in that movie, but there are probably going to be some very confused alt-right people when they watch that movie. I call it a hunch. I think it's been a while since I've seen the Matrix films, but I think they might have misread some of the themes.
That's another podcast, but you mean the alt-right people misread the entire message about a film directed by trans people. Yeah, I would say they missed the mark on that one.
Again, it's been a minute. It's been since 99. I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen The Matrix, but call it a hunch.
All right, James. Well, thank you for taking a lot of time to talk with us a little about your day-to-day and how the pandemic impacted your work and how you're able to educate your students on things like film and philosophy and literature and media literacy. But let's shift to I would say, the more fun part of the conversation today. Now, I've asked you to select 3 films that helped you through this especially challenging year, and I'm really excited to hear what your picks are. So these aren't really ranked in any particular order unless you'd like them to be. Without further ado, let's just jump right into that process. What is the first film you've selected for us today?
Let's go in alphabetical order then, because I don't rank things anymore. I would say there was a movie called And Then We Danced.
ინგლისური სიგარეტი.
ძალიან ნაზი ხარ. უფრო მონუმენტური უნდა იყო, გაიგე?
ბიჭო, არ არის ეს საქმე შენთვის, რატო ვერ გაიგე კაცო შენ, რა?
3, 4, ბავშვი.
გამარჯობა.
ვინ ახარ? იცი სად მოხვედი?
ქართულ ნაციონალურ ანსამბლში.
მე მოიხსენე ეგ საყურე.
ჯო არასწორად აკეთებ. მუხსეცულად ეცემი და იტკენ და ვეღარ იცნობ.
All the movies I'm going to choose here are just going to be 3 of my favorite 2020 films that I saw, but from the Republic of Georgia. And it's about this young man who wants to dance this sort of traditional Georgian dance and is in this dance school. This new kid joins, and the teacher clearly prefers this new kid's style of dancing. So there's kind of this competition there. And wouldn't you know it, our 2 male leads fall in love. And it was one of those moments where I had to research. It's kind of like, like we were talking about earlier, having your phone at home. There were these moments where I'm like, pause, and I'm like, what are Georgian politics? Like, I don't know.
Is this like really edgy for Georgia? Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Turns out, very. Very. They had kind of far right protests after the film who were like, "This is not Georgia." And it's like, "Oh, is it not?" But just, and I didn't know what their laws were. I needed to know the states. Like, I needed to know if this love story had a chance. So I'm like pausing. I'm like, what is going on over there? What are their laws regarding same-sex marriages and civil unions, and just anti-discrimination protections? I didn't know. Now I know. And it's still a very traditional part of the world. And in terms of the dance, it turns out that the country had, in a post-communist world, post-Soviet world, really thought it was important to, and this isn't going to make any sense, but to make the dance more masculine. In their mind, move away from anything that they saw as like communist, right? And they saw same-sex attractions as within that. And so they thought, to be a strong country, we must portray strength, and the dance for our official, it must be that. And so, and you hear this in dialogue from the teacher to our main character, and you're just watching it like masculine dance. Like, what are you like? What? Like, really? Like, oh, okay. So anyway, it's oh my gosh, I didn't know anything about it. It was one of the very last films of the year I watched. I mean, like one of the very last. I had never heard of it, but whenever I'm going through my whenever I'm in award season mode, I'm looking at other critics' top 10 list. I'm looking at Rotten Tomatoes, what kind of has an 80% fresh or higher. I'm looking at other critic groups, not just in America, but across the world. And I just make a list of what I want to watch from there. And toward the end, I saw that this, and Then We Dance had a, like, I think 100%, maybe high 90s, just something incredible. And I was like, well, what is that? And I watched the trailer and I was like, oh my God. And the cinematography is incredible. I mean, just beautiful. There's a scene, and for this scene alone, it deserves accolades. It's a scene, I almost don't want to spoil it, but where one of the characters dances kind of playfully to a song from Robin's latest album from a couple years ago, Honey. And I was so shocked to hear the song in a film because it's such a new album. And the way the lighting in that scene hits at night, and the way the two characters, like one sitting, one dancing, I was giddy. Like, so your question of movies that got me through the year, like when I watched that film, I just felt this rush of energy. I was like, yes, this is cinema. This is what it's supposed to be. I don't know about you. Have you been, like, in recent years, like, just disappointed by movies that a lot of people like, this is awards worthy and this is so important, and we're gonna, and I'm watching it, I'm like, I guess I see how you all got here, but I don't feel it.
Yeah. I don't think you're alone in that. And I think especially just with I would say that that's more so true with like studio films in particular. I feel that way, that the studio films people tend to puff up as like front runners and great films. And sometimes they are pretty good, but yeah, no, I hear you. So when you're watching it, you're just like waiting for the pin to drop. You're like, all right, when's this moment that I'm just the light switch is going to go off?
Yeah. And I had watched a lot of 2020 films, like I said, by the time I got to And Then We Dance. And so there was nothing that had really moved me, except for one film that we'll get to in a moment. Nothing had done it yet. And then I watched that and I was like, good. I was like, I knew it. I was like, I knew. I go back to Waking Life. It's like, I knew you could have this sort of holy moment. And without spoiling, I will say that the final scene of And Then We Danced, if anyone, okay, I will compare it to a scene in I think it's FX Pose, about drag, kind of I guess in some ways kind of like a spiritual sequel to the documentary Paris is Burning. But there was just this moment at the end of that of this film where I was just like, the light. I mean, you can kind of see the way the light's coming in right now in my apartment. There, it was a version of that, and I'm just sitting there just going like, yes, use music, use lighting, use acting, use costume. Like, that's cinema. Cinema is all of those things, and just incredible.
Yeah. So that is that film is And Then We Danced, and is that? Do you happen to know where that's available?
It's on Amazon Prime. You do have to pay for it. I think it's like $3.99 or something like that. But some of the best $4 I've spent in a while.
Awesome. Very good. So check that out. I'll list a link to that in the show notes for you listeners today. And I really like, James, how you're describing this is cinema. And it's I know it seems like a lifetime ago. There was a whole debate online after Scorsese infamously said that Marvel films were not cinema. But there was that whole debate about what is cinema. And I really like your description there, where it's simultaneously the means of all the production coming together to create this beautiful moment. And it's also like deeply personal to you, and that's why cinema is a little different for everybody, but a lot of the ingredients are kind of the same, right? Like all these things came together. And in this moment, I had this emotional, like almost spiritual moment where I was like, this is like truth. This is freedom. It feels great. It feels real. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I I still think that's a conversation that really never got settled very effectively last year. So
I'm so happy you mentioned that Scorsese article. It's one of my very favorites. I share it with the students. I'll be doing that again, probably this semester more importantly than ever. But it's funny, the words you just used, what is cinema? You make me think of that Andre Bazin essay. And there is another lesser known essay. I mean, I think it's in the same book, but it is The Myth of Total Cinema, it's called. It might just be a chapter. It might even just be a section within there. I can't remember. It's so fascinating. And I had misread it for a long time. I thought he was saying it was just impossible. Like, I really took seriously that word myth there. But I reread it with the students a few years ago, and it was just like, oh, I'm dumb. I got this wrong. He was arguing because there was that debate, and I can't remember. I want to say this is the 40s, but there was a debate like, again, what is cinema? And part of the debate was that the image was the most important. That the moving image, that kind of ontology question, like that's the difference between photography and cinema, is that you have the still image with photography and you have movement with cinema. And Bazin just goes one more step. He's like, yeah, but sound. And he's like, and what he does is he goes back to the late 70s in that kind of Muybridge, pre-Edison, Lumiere moment. And he's citing evidence that in that period, there were already conversations of saying it has to be the image with sound. That's how you get total cinema, right? And I just misread it all those years. I don't know how, but I don't know. But anyway, so when I watch a movie like And Then We Danced, and it's using all those different elements to recreate reality, to represent reality. Woo! That's when I'm just like, you get it? You've done your homework, movie. You read Bazin, or whatever. I don't know.
Oh man, it's true. And it feels like, to your point though, I feel like even in some of the quote unquote best movies, there is a lack of that a lot of times, or a lack of that impactful moment. So I think that's a great recommendation. And I think exactly the kind of movie moments that were hard to come by in 2020. So again, that movie is And Then We Danced. James, let's go on to your second film. What was your next selection?
My next one, we're just staying alphabetically here, is actually a documentary. Buckle up, everybody, because you're going to have to break it up into probably a 4-day viewing, an hour a day. But City Hall.
How do we tell the story about what's happening here? Like, what's the story that Boston's trying to tell?
We have great prosperity in the city of Boston right now. And 1 out of every 6 Bostonians struggle with food insecurity. We need to work together to tackle this issue to get that number to 0.
There is no doubt that there are disparities that exist. And there are systemic barriers and policy barriers. And we want to address them.
In my years of being president of NAACP, there was never this much focus on being involved in civil rights.
Frederick Wiseman. He just follows city employees, from public works to planning, dealing with housing and homelessness and equity conversations. He follows the mayor who Biden has just appointed to his cabinet. He follows just the day-to-day inner workings of city government. And I'm not just talking about the city council meetings. I'm talking about like the boards, the commissions, the trust, the department meetings. There is a lengthy zoning meeting, not within the city hall itself, but out in the community where this neighborhood that has just clearly been left behind in terms of so much infrastructure investment. This new marijuana business wants to come into their neighborhood, and it is just this lengthy back and forth where the camera, kind of similar to a cinema verite kind of approach, those sort of fly on the wall type documentaries where the camera's just there and just lets people. It's not like it's not talking heads. It's not that. It is the camera is just in that room and it's just watching reality happen. And it's just engaging and listening to those residents. Just for example, in that zoning discussion, you just feel this. It's getting at these steep social fissures, the lack of trust between the community and the city, this developer, and you see this negotiation that's happening back and forth, resident by resident. You know, what type of business responsibility they think that this applicant has to their neighborhood, and I just thought it was just so. Let me put it this way: I don't know that I've seen something that captures how government works as well, and I cannot enough recommend it. It was on PBS, so you might kind of Google around PBS. I know I watched it on the PBS app on my Roku player. And again, I think it's 4.5 hours long. I, again, am a bit of a masochist. So I actually, one whole day, just watched all of it. I took breaks. I'm human. But I was riveted. I was just like, it was so helpful. And for me as an elected official, it was just one of those things where it's so hard sometimes to convey what my day-to-days are to people where, it's not that I'm just in a council meeting. You know, I might have a council meeting on Tuesday from 8:30 to noon, although they've been going so much longer than that. But then, from 1 to 2, I might have a meeting with Public Works. From 2 to 3, I might have a meeting with a resident. From 3 to 4, I might have a meeting with a nonprofit. And that nonprofit, it could be about homelessness. The resident, it could be about drainage. The Public Works, it could be about sidewalk. You see what I mean? Like it's so much. And I think that this documentary just does an exemplary job of bringing us into how city government works. And I think ultimately makes the case for government, like makes the case that government is people, makes the case that government, I mean, it's kind of quoting from Dante and FDR, governments may err, but better they try than to be frozen in icy indifference. I'm paraphrasing there, but that's pretty much the quote. And it was that reminder. And you can see in those meetings where people are just like really struggling to, address youth homelessness and realizing what some of the pushback is from some of the agencies already addressing the issue, or, from residents, and equity issues in terms of youth of color who are experiencing homelessness. Or, I mean, it's just, I hope that does not sound boring to everyone. I'm telling you, it was a movie that if I had ranked movies, it would have easily been in my top 5. In fact, when I voted, it was.
Yeah, no, and I don't, of course, everyone's got to pick their interest, but, we talked a lot about the importance of media literacy at the top. I also think something that's quite maybe become even more important in the last few years is government literacy, or maybe policy literacy is probably the best way to put it. And I know, at least from my perspective, ever since I watched The Wire in college, specifically when you like seasons 3 and 4, and you start to see how city policy impacts all aspects of a community, really became of interest to me, at least. So I think I'm very excited to check it out. It's one of those, I think it came out right at the tail end of last year, so I haven't gotten to it yet. For our listeners here in Oklahoma, I believe it is, yes, on the PBS app. I believe it is also on the OETA website. Make sure to check that out. And again, I think just how does government work? How do these changes, systematic changes, work? Having not seen the documentary, James, the thing that you described is really, I think, that aspect is what attracts me to it. So recommend that as well.
And don't feel overwhelmed, everybody. Like, watch it in chunks. Like, if 30 minutes is what you got, 30 minutes is what you got, and just make it manageable.
Yeah, most definitely. And that is one of the benefits, or silver linings, depending on your preference, of watching things at home versus in the theater. You actually can take an intermission at your leisure. In fact, I just tweeted about this morning, there was an announcement that Kong versus Godzilla got moved up to March, and I was kind of disappointed because I wanted to see it, was hoping to see it in the theater. And I said, does anyone else feel conflicted? And overwhelmingly, the Twitter responses were, well, I can watch it with my pants off on my couch, get subtitles, and pause to go to the bathroom. So no, so, take advantage of the watch from home experience.
I'm glad you mentioned the subtitles. This will drive my best friend Randy mad. I'm in a place in my life where I want subtitles on when I'm watching something. I don't know if it's because of my creative writing MFA that I did, and I've just kind of focused more on writing in my mind. It's so important in the way that I think about every shot mattering and everything within a shot mattering. I'm very interested in the intersection between the image, the sound, and the words we're hearing. I think it's all poetry, all of it. And sometimes if I'm missing words or whatever, like for instance, I saw The Lighthouse at home. It was a screener a year ago. And as I was watching it with the subtitles, I was just sitting there going, who saw this in the theater and who understood it? Like what? And if they did, whoa, good job. Smarter than me. Cause I was watching it at home and I was just like, without these subtitles, clueless Willem Dafoe's monologues. It's like clueless. Like,
well, another example from 2020 that I find interesting, Christopher Nolan's Tenet, where I know he has in the past been criticized for, how audible his dialogue is in various of his films. I have to say Tenet is the most aggressive of, or maybe the worst offender, as in there are times when people are talking, but what they're saying competes so much with the sound effects and everything. You literally have to like pause and rewind. What did they say? So I will say whenever I watch that film, I definitely put the subtitles on for that exact reason that you just described there.
I tried and the app didn't let me put them on, and I got mad. I really didn't care for that film. That was a film that is exactly what I was describing earlier, where I know I'm supposed to like it. I watched Memento as one of my shelter in place movies because I owned it and hadn't seen it in a long time. So I'm a fan, but I was really disappointed in Dunkirk a few years ago, and Tenet did not make it better. And you're exactly right. That is, and talk about just cold, distant characters. Like, who are these people? Why am I don't understand. Was actually kind of proud of our organization for voting it the most disappointing films. Like, good.
I think it was a good pick, especially with all the hype might not be the right word, but maybe it's hype around it being still released in theaters during the pandemic. I think it was a risk that didn't quite pay off in a variety of ways. On our review we did for it a few weeks ago, our joke was, well, unlike was Interstellar, or even maybe The Prestige, the main character did not have a wife and kid to try to get back home to or something. There was like the element of like emotional investment that the audience can easily plug into just wasn't there.
Oh, big time. I almost cannot think of another movie that is the example of what I would say is wrong with kind of the big budget and intellectual big budget Hollywood film, where it's like, who? And Dunkirk was the pulling back of it for me, of the veil, because I remember watching it and 10, 15 minutes into it, I was like, why am I watching another war movie where the lead protagonist is white, straight, and male? Whereas I had just watched, before anyone tries to drag me for that, let me just say this, I had just watched an 8-hour long, I think it's Hugh Strachan, World War I documentary, hour episodes each. And I loved it. And one of the things I loved about it, and the same thing with the World War II documentary I watched around the same time that was, maybe 22 hours long. But what I loved about each of those two documentaries was, and it was the first time this has ever happened, where when I was watching something about World War I and World War II, it did not just take place in Europe. It was, we were fighting in Asia. We were fighting in North Africa, the Middle East. And I was like, oh yeah, World War, there it is. And so as I was watching Dunkirk, I was like, why are we not making movies that are set in, Cambodia or in Algeria? And why aren't we telling the multitude of stories and perspectives? So I was just bored to tears watching Dunkirk, and then to watch Tenet, it was like, why are we spending all of this money even with a protagonist who is of color, why are we doing this? What's the message? Like, what's the theme? Like, what truths are we trying to get at here? Why are we wasting people's time?
Do you ever feel like, but we are so off topic, right? I'll close it with this, like, and this might be another podcast one day, but Christopher Nolan, certainly a director I love and admire. And I think I was middle of the road on that movie. I didn't hate it, didn't like it, but I will say I agree with your criticisms are spot on. One, there's not really an emotional core, and two, like, what is it they're trying to communicate? What are the themes that people are supposed to take away and think apply to their life in some sort of way? And I just wonder with Christopher Nolan, he's one of those guys who's gotten so much power to do whatever he wants. It's almost like the more times he makes a movie, the more he becomes almost like what's the word? He is like becoming self-parody because he's done it so many times and he's doing the same thing over and over again. We know there's going to be a dead wife or there's going to be kids to get back to, or, you know what I mean? There's like the tropes of a Chris Nolan movie are very on display, and it's disappointing to see him not really adjusting or growing as a filmmaker, at least in that respect.
Totally nailed it.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to your final selection today. James, what is the last movie that comes to mind when you think about films that got you through the year of unprecedented times?
Some people who know me will not be at all surprised by this, but please know I surprised myself when I watched it, loved it, put it in my top 5 whenever we voted, but the Invisible Man remake.
Adrian, he was a sociopath. He said that I could never leave him. He controlled how I looked and what I wore. Then it was controlling when I left the house. And eventually, what I thought. I'm sorry, I can't take you with me. I'm not gonna leave you with that thing on. Are you okay?
I mean, I loved it. And again, when I say I loved it, I just had this emotional response to it. And that's just ultimately what I can't fake. You know what I mean? Like, either I feel something or I don't. And that particular day, we had just a very emotional city council meeting, like very emotional. I can't remember. I think it had to do with like race and gender and probably the pandemic. It was just a whole mess of a day. And I don't know why, but for some reason that day, domestic violence was on my mind. And I already just felt very emotionally drained. Council was very long. And then I got home, did some things, can't even remember what I did, but there was a lot of things I had to do before I could like wind down. And then the last thing I did was like, I'm going to watch a movie. I'm just going to put something on. And I have HBO and I was like, ooh, Invisible Man. And I watched it. Could not take my eyes off the screen the entire time. Couldn't do it. So that whole thing we talked about earlier of having the phone and the distractions of laundry and this, I just laid there in bed, just staring at my laptop, just like, what? Like, what? I love allegory. It's literally, I mean, you heard what my classes are, right now, where they're looking at these sort of allegorical conversations and what's the relationship between the society and the art the society is producing. But I also hate like beat you over the head, like paint by numbers allegory, where it's like walking you through the message. It's like, I'm not dumb. I'm really not. I'm really, really not. So don't treat me like I am. And I thought what Invisible Man pulled off so well is that it is a film about the treatment of women, particularly in the Me Too era. That's been a conversation we're having. But on its surface, it is not, it is it is and it isn't, it's this movie where I think why I couldn't take my eyes off of it was it did such an effective job. The camera did so early on positioning us with the Elizabeth Moss character. And we don't know what exactly she's up to in those opening moments as she's trying to sneak away from her husband. And we start realizing, going, oh my goodness, he must be abusive. Like, that's what this is. It's kind of like the movie Sleeping with the Enemy. It's kind of got that vibe. And you realize that the care she's taking to try and get out of this house. And it just was so tense. Maybe being the kid of someone who grew up in such an environment, it kind of struck a nerve. But I was just with her, and I was never not with her for the rest of the movie. I thought that film and her performance, like the camera work and her performance, do such a great job of positioning us with her experiences. And think about it. I mean, we don't know the backstory in those opening moments. We just see this woman in the middle, right? We're there. And I just thought it nailed it. Like, it nailed it. And it's smarter than the Halloween 2018 film, which I enjoyed, but smarter. I mean, insofar as like that moment where Jamie Lee Curtis says "time's up" to the two podcast interviewers, like, Jamie, I'm not dumb. We are dealing with trauma. I'm here to deal with trauma with you. Let's go for it. But I don't need you to tell me the allegory. Like, don't tell me the theme. And Invisible Man never does. Never. And I thought that was, and maybe I missed it, but it was just very well done. The special effects, I thought the way they made sense of how someone could be, quote, invisible was just like, oh, I had so much fun, but it wasn't like over the top special effects either. So those were my three. I just really loved them.
I think, yeah, I'm right there with you talking about how they're able to put you in the shoes of Elizabeth Moss's character. And yeah, her performance in that is probably not going to get any awards, though I do wonder if it should, because she's really spectacular. And the fact that I myself questioned along with her, maybe she is crazy. Like there was a couple of points where you're like, maybe there's something we didn't know about. There's backstory. Like you said, there's missing backstory. There's something here. And you're like, I don't want to, because I'm rooting for her. And obviously that would play into a certain type of trope on its own. But I'm also like, the way that her performance worked and the way the camera set up and like the way they sort of threw in the red herrings, there were moments where you're like, maybe nothing's actually going on. But of course, we don't want to spoil the film. There's certainly a lot of things that occur that make you question and validate certain things about her experiences. So yeah, James, those are great picks, great selections. Of course, listener, that last one, The Invisible Man, I'll have links to all these in the show notes. Now, James, before we've been talking here for a good while, and thanks for just taking the time out of your day. I do have, if you're up for it, we have one last lightning round, 90 seconds, where we'll run down. You can just start throwing anything and everything that you want to throw out there. It could be another film, could be a television show, a book, heck, it could be a band or a song, like things that got you through the pandemic. What do you think?
Let's do it.
Let's start.
Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. I revisited the entire trilogy very early on in Shelter in Place. And, these lines from Frodo, like, and from, I can't remember if it's Merry or Pitt, but, these lines like, I wish the ring had never come to me, from Frodo. And Gandalf's response, no one wants to live in these sorts of times. And you hear that with the Merry and Pippin conversation. Cannot tell you how important that was to hear. So important. And to see people on the edge of defeat with the Battle of Helm's Deep. And every time Gandalf shows up at the end with the cavalry, I am a blubbering mess. It without fail. John Carpenter's They Live, rewatched that, loved it. I think we're living through that moment of just rampant consumerism at the expense of our souls. Scream 2, if you really want to understand the role of media violence, I will always preach the gospel of Scream 2. The PBS documentary, The United States of Conspiracy, I would recommend to kind of better understand how these conspiracy theories are taking hold. The new Flying Lotus album I adored. I think it's great. Tierra Whack's on there. It's Solange. You'll have a blast. And then Stacey Abrams' new book, I thought was just a wonderful way to kind of help think through where we are right now.
All right, time. James, you did it. Those were some really great recommendations. Before we close out, I did want to give you an opportunity just for you to give listeners a way to find you if they want to keep up with you online. So where can they find you at?
Yeah, so never on Twitter. Just make sure that's very clear. We do have an adorable little cartoon on my Twitter page. It's got like a little telephone from the 50s. It's like, you can call my office. I'm always happy to do those meetings. But James for OKC, like James and then FOR and then OKC. I'm on Twitter because I love images, in case you guys haven't caught on. And then Facebook, although, but yeah, I'll probably, once a week be doing some sort of updates for people on what's going on in Ward 2 in the city and eventually my top 10 list from last year. So.
Of course, fantastic. And of course, you could, if you're a member or resident of Oklahoma City, you could just check out some of those meetings you guys have.
Every Tuesday, 8:30 in the morning, every other Tuesday, excuse me. You can watch on the City of OKC's YouTube channel. Our agenda becomes available the Friday afternoon prior to city council meetings. If you ever need to reach out to me for official council business, remember I represent Ward 2. So ward2 at okc.gov.
All right. Well, there you have it, listeners. Follow James in those ways. And it sounds like he's pretty available to take your calls, emails, or get your thoughts on multiple things. So, James, before we close out, is there anything else you would like to say about any of these three films, or maybe better support your work as an educator or a city council person?
I also just have to do a quick plug for Sound of Metal. The sound editing. Oh my God. Total cinema. So I would just kind of throw a plug in for that film as well. And never, rarely, always, sometimes. I might have gotten some of those words mixed up, but great film. Great two films. That's all I would really add is check out those two films. Just follow me on social media, especially this summer, because I'm going to need the community's help as we start revisiting some stuff with the police budget. We've set some really great things in motion for some investments in mental health services and violence interruption programs and homeless outreach that I'm going to need the community's support. If you agree with those things, which I'm guessing a lot of you do, so and hoping. So that's it. Thank you for that opportunity, Caleb. And thank you for doing this podcast. And I think Churchill said something about when during World War II, people were like, throw away the art or whatever, and let's just fight. And he's like, then what are we fighting for? I'm getting that story a little off, but so it's very important for people like you to keep doing this work. So thank you.
Well, it's nothing compared to all the great things you're doing for our city and also just for the next generation of filmmakers and just citizens. So we appreciate you. So James Cooper, film studies educator, member of the Oklahoma Film Critics Circle and Ward 2 City Council person here in Oklahoma City. Thank you so much for joining the Cinematic Schematic today.
Thank you. And thank you for, I think, wearing a Legend of Zelda sweater.
You caught it. Wow. That is impressive. Good job. That's it, everybody. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Maze on scene, y'all.
Thank you for tuning into the fourth part of our ongoing series on 3 films that got you through the 2020 pandemic with special guest James Cooper. Stay tuned to hear who we'll be talking with next week. Now, if you would like to participate in this series and have your 3 picks heard, please consider sending us those films that got you through the pandemic to our email address, thecinemetropolis@gmail.com. You can send us your picks to have a chance to have them read on the air later in the series. And I'd also like to note that if you did enjoy today's conversation, please rate the podcast and subscribe on your preferred podcast app. You can also find all of our work on The Cinemetropolis by following us on Twitter at The Cinemetrop or on Facebook at facebook.com/The Cinemetropolis. And you can also keep up with more of my work, including my thoughts on films, television, video games, by following me on Twitter at CMastersTalk. That is letter C, Masters Talk. Join me next week when I sit down for a conversation with the managing editor at Collider.com, Adam Chitwood. I'll talk with Adam about his 3 film selections as well as how the pandemic impacted large entertainment publications like Collider in 2020. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you again next time.